Thanks for joining me tonight, taking time away from the workshop. And so this is a lecture that it comes from a class that I taught this past semester, and then I taught the same class 2 years before. And so it was a cross-disciplinary class between fashion and architecture students. And so the first part of this lecture really comes from looking at the relationship between technology, art, architecture, and fashion as if kind of co-evolved. And I think there's been a lot of cross-pollination between the different disciplines that I think it's valuable to go back and look at it. To understand maybe where we are going and some of the potentials for the future. So as we begin to think about fashion and architecture, there's a lot of similarities. They both protect our body from the weather, from the sun, or thermal conditions. You go back far enough, there's some material similarities. The difference maybe is one of scale. Right? Fashion is for one body, mostly, and architecture is for many bodies. At what scale does fashion kind of become architecture? There's a distance away from the body that defines architecture versus fashion. Typically fashion closer, architecture a little bit further away. I think Victor and Rolf provide an interesting kind of question with their this particular Russian doll dress. And so as we start to go back towards the beginning of the 20th century, I'm going to go through the 20th century very fast. There's a lot I'm going to miss. So I'm just picking out a few moments. So the Art Nouveau at the turn of the century, incredibly important and influential. It's also dealing with a certain type of opulence, expressing the wealth that was being generated. Vienna secession as well, being founded. There's a precursor to modernism that we can see underlying. But there's still, with the gold, the wealth of the opulence is still expressed. Gustav Klimt, one of the members of Vienna secession, probably one of the best known members. But then as we look at the Edwardian era of fashion, extremely opulent, very fine silk, a lot of decoration. And so it was really expressing the wealth that they had. And it had a lot to do with class, like how much money you had, and expressing that wealth through fashion. This is also when we see the Industrial Revolution really starting to have an effect. This is the precursor to sweatshops, where just people are packed in making clothes. But it was the rise of the ready-to-wear, so off of the shelf, not just couture, haute couture is just ready-to-wear. And so that was really developed with these sweatshops. For technology, kind of jumping back in time a little bit before the 20th century, but a very important aspect was the balloons and being able to leave the ground. And so, back in 1783, Etienne Julien, the first balloon flight, but really in 1862 is when they reached 10,000 meters, and they almost died because no one really understood altitude at that point, and so they managed to let the air out of the balloon before they passed out, or else they would have died. And so they're starting to understand the environment, our environment that we breathe, and its relationship to altitude and how we need to begin to control that. The turn of the century also brought us the mass-produced automobile, right, affordable to the masses, first flight, first kind of East Coast to West Coast of the United States telephone call, and kinetoscope, which was the beginning of film. So huge advancements in technology that were accessible by the public. And so World War I happens, and following World War I, fashion is one place that we can see the rationalization because of the lack of materials, lack of money, and the kind of shortage of labor from the war. Produced a fashion that was very kind of stripped down, not much ornament anymore, and so it's kind of the first wave of simplicity, and starting to celebrate that, and still producing a very interesting design, just very stripped down. And so Balenciaga and Coco Chanel, then La Garçon, a very influential book about a young woman who goes off on her own, develops her own life, and is kind of pursuing her own desires. And so it was very influential in terms of women's liberation. And it inspired a certain hairstyle of independence. And that was also started to reflect in fashion. And so, new markets were opening up in fashion for performance-related fashion, so for sports. So really starting to think about not just fashion as a design statement, but in terms of how your body moves and how it reacts to the body. So performance is now starting to open up these new markets in fashion. The influence of World War I and this kind of performance-related fashion is still having very much of an influence. Women now kind of dressing like men did. And so it's changing culture, and we see it kind of maybe first in fashion. So one of the most obvious ways that we can see culture changing. With architecture, of course, we know this story quite well. With the functionalism, stripping down modernism, having a huge effect on the way we start to design. Bauhaus, of course, mixing art and multiple forms of design, but a very functionalist approach to thinking about architecture and industrial design and art altogether. Carrier Corporation, now we're able to control our environments, not just the facades of our buildings, but now we're actually controlling the interior air. So we're manufacturing our own weather inside. A very important moment, first used in hospitals, but then a couple of years later, the first air conditioning system put into a residential building for just comfort level. So in hospitals, it was for health, but now, 7 years later, now it's for comfort. So really being able to control the weather in the interior environment. Military, starting to take on technology. And so balloons now being used for military purposes, for observation, trying to go higher. And so the realization that you need to now protect the body. You need to make your own environment to be able to survive. And so at almost 13,000 and a half meters, you can see he's in a full protective suit now to be able to breathe. He has oxygen, a tank that he's breathing. So you have to now create your own personal environment. And so fashion is the way of creating that, the smallest kind of architectural environment that you can. again, the Great Depression, another time of shortage of money, shortage of materials, and so again, simplifying. And so even extremely wealthy people are kind of expressing the simplicity through their dress. And so it was kind of an important moment as well. Lisa Schiaparelli, 35. This is the first time she's a fashion designer, and she was collaborating with Salvador Dali. And this is the first themed collection, fashion collection. Something that we take for granted now, right? All fashion shows are themed, but this is the first one. So it was kind of an interesting moment, especially with the collaboration with Dali. But also, Schiaparelli taking advantage of new technology. Here, maybe it's the technology of a zipper. Maybe not so exciting now, but at that point, zippers were hidden. And so she's taking the zipper and exposing it, and it becomes part of the fashion. So it's that functionalism coming forward and being expressed. So at the same time, different fabrics were being developed, and so kind of spandex type, stretchable fabrics. Here, making new corsets or girdles. This one for men, so if you're getting that nice little belly, it can help suck it in. And so, corsets, of course, have been around for, I actually don't even know how long before this, probably at least a century. Probably longer. But now, new advancements in technology of materials are allowing different types of corsets to be made. And so this is kind of fashion and technology working together. So in 1932, Wiley Post, he's a pilot. He wants to break the record for around-the-world flight. And so he takes his just single prop plane, and this is his flight suit, literally a suit. And he beats the record by 2 weeks. The record, I guess, was a Zeppelin to fly around the world. And so as he's making this flight, he's flying low because he needs to fly low to breathe. But he realizes that it would be much easier if you fly higher above the clouds. And so then he works with B.F. Goodrich, which is a company that makes tires, to make this rubber suit and make a fully enclosed environment so he can fly higher. I love this particular image, though. He can't even stand up straight. He's so heavy, this helmet. But instead of modifying the airplane to make an environment for him, he modifies the suit. And so it's interesting, right? He could have modified what for us would have been the architecture, the hard shell environment of the airplane. But he decides to change his suit instead to make a more personal environment. So this functionalism starts to become an organizational system. Here, Tehrani, taking the grids, juxtaposing the grids, and it's organizing the entire building, not just the facade. Alvarado, taking this functionalism, but has a sensuality to it. There's a softness to it. And so he provides an interesting counterpoint to the very hard functionalism. And it opens up some possibilities. And so the same, not much later, 1940, Playtex is now making a girdle or a corset out of rubber, so latex rubber. And so again, kind of a new technology replacing the old fabric corsets. But this is one now that moves with you because it's the rubber, it stretches. So they're kind of seeing it as a whole new skin. And so it's this new skin that's creating another environment for you. Of course, it's one that's about reshaping the body more than anything else. So it's more aesthetic. But it's also an interesting moment given where this story is going to go with Playtex very soon. World War II, another simplification because of lack of money, lack of resources, lack of materials. So very utilitarian. That's also inspiring kind of a do-it-yourself culture of repairing. And so many fashion magazines were showing people how to make repairs and do their own sewing. And so as part of this kind of maker culture, it comes around out of necessity at times. Going back to the military, a lot of technological developments because of the military. On the left, again, B.F. Goodrich, the tire company, after working with Wiley Post, see this as an opportunity for people to be able to fly higher. And so they're developing this completely enclosed suit. And again, just super heavy, a guy can't even stand up straight. And so that's on one side. And then the first G suit, which was really for being able to fly faster. And so we're developing two different types of suits here. On the left is the G suit. Again, it's more like a corset, right? The old corsets that are tied. And the G suit is really about being able to accelerate really quickly and make sharp turns. Because when you're in an airplane and you make a sharp turn, all the blood goes down to your legs and you pass out. And then you lose control of the plane and die. And so the G suits are pressuring all parts of your body to keep the blood at your head, so that when you accelerate quickly or go around turns. And so that was really necessary. I like his dress shoes. They're obviously a staged photo. But on the right, the full pressure suit. So again, it's applying pressure to your body to keep the blood at your head. But it's a fully enclosed, sealed environment. So here, it's about flying higher, as well as being able to make the sharp turns. So it's a single envelope versus this is made out of multiple pieces. So two different developments that are happening. Of course, Alan Turing, bomb code to break the Enigma. Huge moment for computation. Right? It's really the beginning of understanding what are the possibilities of computation. And then, was it just 1 year or 3 years later, he builds his, basically the first programmable computer. Again, another amazing achievement. And it sets the motion for where we are now, obviously. So following World War II, there's a lot that people want to forget about World War II, completely understandable. And so Christian Dior is coming out with the new look. And the new look is really about escape. And so using fashion as a way to maybe escape your life, your memories. And so it's still resembling some of the stripped down, rational lack of ornamentation, somewhat. But now there's, the corset is back. I mean, that doesn't even look human to be able to be that tight. There's a lot more material, but it also marks a significant change in how people, the general public, is understanding fashion. And so this is way ahead of where we are with architecture. And so here, most people are understanding this fashion through photography and magazines and publishing. And so just in 1953, there was 1,300 articles just in the American press on Christian Dior. And so everyone is consuming fashion through photography, which of course now is how we consume architecture, right? Mostly through photography. But the fashion was far ahead of everyone else. And so all the magazines are writing about the new look. And so they're still discussing, simplifying, stripping away ornament, but it's really the corset underneath that is not seen that makes it all possible. So there's this interesting relationship between the image of simplicity and the infrastructure that makes it possible. And so the corset, of course, is what makes flight possible at higher altitudes, at faster speeds. So Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, and very quickly, breaking the sound barrier, and then 1948 going higher, 53, 24,000 meters and twice the speed of sound. Is pretty significant advances in technology. But our ability to survive in these conditions relies on completely controlling our environment. Post-war technology, what do we do with that? That's where Ames, we're looking at converting all this, the factories in Los Angeles, which were, there was a lot of wartime manufacturing in Los Angeles, especially if we're going to the Pacific. And so they were looking at ways of taking the factories that were producing for the war and translating that into architecture. So using standardized steel components as this kit of parts that comes from the factory that you could set up in multiple different ways. And that was really the start of the case study houses. And so the case study houses were really part of, it was initiated by a magazine to be able to do marketing, obviously to sell more magazines, but to show people how they could live in a modern way and using modern architecture. And so it was really about getting modernism to the public, to the masses. Here, Neutra's Kaufmann House, and the photograph as being the way to sell that image of modern living, modern life. The influence of this escapism from Dior, influencing Balenciaga, Jacques Fath, and quite a few people. Even with Balenciaga's references to more classic modernism, very, very clean lines. Yves Van der Rohe, kind of beyond functionalism, taking functionalism as an idea, but it's hard to say that he's really a functionalist anymore. With maybe the structural expression not necessarily being the most practical, but it's really about trying to express the idea of functionalism more than actually making it functional. And so that's kind of also this interesting shift in modernism. The first programmable mill, 1952. This is punch cards. So you fed the machine cards and it would follow the program. So some of these technologies which we think are new are not so new. The first robotic arm, 1956. I think it's just interesting to place where we are now, and maybe it's just the accessibility of robotics. Nylon, woven nylon, something we take for granted now. It was this high-tech material at the time. And so as they're developing these suits to try and go higher into the atmosphere, getting ready for space, and to put people in outer space. They're developing, they need kind of new material technology to be able to make the suits lightweight enough and to sustain life. And so they're taking this nylon And somebody at the company did this really interesting thing. They painted it silver. They didn't need to paint it silver. The original ones were kind of the green, the military green. But they painted it silver, and by doing that, they made the new image of space suits, right? And they did. I mean, that's still how we think of space suits. And so probably more importantly is, you know, they made that image. And so there's several companies that are interested in making the spacesuit. You know, everybody knows we're going to try and put somebody in outer space. So we're going to keep going higher and higher. And so ILC, International Latex Corporation, they make the Playtex girdle. They see this as an opportunity. They have this new technology. They have, you know, the latex. And they see the opportunity to build a new flight suit. And so here, that's the BF Goodrich. They're starting to work with other companies, but they see this as a whole new market for them. And so they start to combine this woven mesh material, this kind of nylon webbing, which is used in bras. They combine it with the latex, and now they have a system that is very strong, lightweight, and kind of protects the body from the lack of air outside. And so, you know, Playtex Corporation is now in the space suit business. So very much a direct connection between fashion and technology. Sputnik, of course, huge moment. The United States is scared. They lost the race to be in outer space first, putting a satellite. And so the next year, NASA is formed. And so the United States government decides they're going to put a lot of money into trying to put somebody in outer space. And so there's several companies I was mentioning that are looking to develop this spacesuit. This one company, Lytton, they make this completely vacuum chambered suit. I mean, it looks like a 1950s science fiction space alien, right? But they're also, you know, defining this image of the spacesuit more than anything. 1960s, there's new affluence, there's new money to be spent on fashion. And so it's opening up whole new markets for fashion. Nina Ricci making a little bit more opulent, more free fashion at the time. Of course, Breakfast at Tiffany's, you know, this huge movie. Givenchy making this really classic modern dress, but with kind of more contemporary lines at the time. Extremely influential. And we also mark the end of the case study houses. And so the case study program happened for quite a number of years, but kind of ending with the Stahl residence, probably one of the most iconic photos of the case study houses overlooking Los Angeles. The house just kind of looking like it's floating, like a spaceship flying over LA. But again, this is the getting modernism, modern architecture to the masses. It's what Dwell is today, right? Yves Saint Laurent becoming much more bold as this new market is opening in fashion. This younger market, so it's really opening up for the teenage market. And so where there wasn't really a market before, now with this kind of newfound money and wealth, the fashion is becoming much kind of younger. It's looking to pop art and optical art at the time. Obviously Mondrian, very bright, bold colors. Pucci, I think, is really interesting because the influence of the jet set culture, right? So airplanes are now becoming very affordable. You can fly, where before it was really just the military or private airplanes. And so is the development of the commercial airlines. And so Pucci making uniforms for this Banif Airlines, but even the advertisements, right, kind of celebrating the technology of the jet set culture and the kind of science fiction quality of these kind of helmets. And so, Eero Saarinen, the JFK terminal, and so it's opening up the jet set culture and making it public. And so now we're starting to define space for the jet set culture. Again, Pucci, starting to make kind of performance wear for sports. It's it's the 1960s. It's much more kind of bold colors. Again, the teenage market is really opening up design freedom. There's also this idea of freedom of mobility, and so I think architecture is starting to explore that. The house of the future, using new materials, plastics and fiberglass, so lightweight panels. Monsanto, which we usually think of now as trying to destroy the environment through manufactured seeds. Before they got into that, they were a plastics company. And so here at Disneyland, they made the house of the future using plastic. And so it was a time of really thinking about the possibilities of new materials and how that could redefine the way we make architecture, very lightweight, portable, movable. The first graphic user interface. And so this was a light pen that Ivan Sutherland was drawing on an actual screen. And so before it was always just key commands. And so here, really starting to think of the computer as a graphic device. Obviously, hugely important to us now. So there was a company, Bell Labs, and it came from Alexander Graham Bell. Made telephones. Bell Labs was an engineering company that did extremely innovative engineering. They did a lot of work for the United States government as well, a lot of top secret projects. But as an engineer, that was the place to work. They were doing most of the patents. The most innovative technology was happening out of Bell Labs. They decided to partner with artists and develop these series of kind of these 9 evenings where they're combining theater and engineering. And so they're using some of the latest technology they had of video projection, recording and sound, and creating these kind of interactive live performances. And so you have people like John Cage and Robert Rauschenberg, probably 2 of the best known, working with engineers. So it's really starting to bring engineering kind of out from behind the closed doors and understanding that there's an engineering culture. And engineering and art have opportunities for invention and innovation. I think, again, a really important moment in understanding the possibilities of engineering. One of the biggest fads ever, the miniskirt, just went everywhere in the world at the same time. So I put that in there just because it reached so many people so quickly through media. So back to the military. We're in the space race now. The United States government is putting a lot of money to try to get the first person in space. And so there's, again, multiple companies that are trying to make the spacesuit. And so there's International Latex Corporation. There's Hamilton Standard, which is a big military, it's a private company, but they do only military work. And so they were the ones who should have been guaranteed the job, because they knew everybody in the military. You know, after you retire from the military, you go to work for Hamilton Standard. And so, you know, it's the big, powerful company versus the little fashion company that makes bras and girdles and corsets. But then there's this Lytton again, and there's Ames Research. And so there's different approaches to what a spacesuit should be. Hamilton Standard and Lytton making these hard suits. So it's almost like a personal spaceship. And so, but all of these are failures. You know, it's too heavy, or they can't get into the spaceship because they're too big, or you can't move very well. And so, you know, several years are going by, and they're trying all these different suits, and they keep failing. And so it really comes down to two suits, two companies. And so we have International Latex Corporation with their soft suit. And then you have Lytton, and they're actually working with Hamilton Standard to make the hard suit. And so really this is what we would think of, probably if we think of a spacesuit, right? Something that's hard and you know, nothing can go through. But you know, NASA was really trying to decide which was the one that should win the contract. So International Latex Corporation, they go to a local high school and they make a video. And they have an engineer in the spacesuit playing, you know, American football with one of the other engineers. So they're running, they're catching the ball, they're falling down, they're getting up, and they sent that in, and they won the contract, right? Because they needed a suit that was able to do multiple functions, and the soft suit is what could handle all the different demands. So I think it was also pretty smart, right? But it's also using the moving image, right, to film as a way to communicate. Robert Rauschenberg, you know, among many artists, I think the influence of the space race and putting a man on the moon is huge in terms of culture. So Robert Rauschenberg looking at Kennedy and, you know, Kennedy's influence on kind of dedicating money to the space race. And even the spacesuit, right, finds its way into Rauschenberg's artwork. Pierre Cardin, yeah, the influences on kind of this idea of futuristic and this kind of optimism of the future. Yeah, the kind of space helmet. But even, I find it really interesting when I look back at these, the geometry is actually very contemporary for today, especially this one. But there's this really interesting influence of technology on the culture of design. Archigram, obviously the pop culture aspect of archigram, the freedom of movement. So this kind of counterculture that's becomes incredibly important in the late 60s. And so a lot of this has to do with technology and the availability of technology that makes life easier. The idea of the walking city, or mega-structural ideas where you're able to kind of move your pod with you, move around the world, but also this idea of consumer culture, right? And it's a critique of the capitalism and consumer culture. Rainer Banham, Francois Dallegray, talking about the influence of technology defining our environment, right? All this equipment is really starting to define the environment that we sense every day, our interior environment, more than the shell of the building, the skin of the building. EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. It's an interesting group of artists and engineers that came out of that, the 9 evenings with Bell Labs. And so they were a group, they were not architects, they're artists and engineers that made this Pepsi pavilion at the Osaka World's Fair. And so it was this kind of one of the first times when technology was really used to make a responsive environment. And so it was an environment that was completely immersive. It was about sound, it was vision. So inside, they didn't design that pavilion, they just designed the interior. And so it's this inflatable environment, this reflective film. And so it was about sound, about controlling the atmosphere, about light. So it's a completely immersive environment with technology. Again, a really fascinating moment. And so the capsule tower coming out of, there's several examples. But this is probably one of the better examples of the kind of plug-in city, right? This idea of the mobility of the unit. And so it comes out of the megastructural ideas that were being developed that Archigram was also being influenced by or helped to influence. And so it's this idea of mobility, even if it never really happened. It was just kind of plugged in once, and those modules stayed. So 1970s, a very interesting time of liberation and rebellion. And so Yves Saint Laurent, really starting to understand this current, probably more to do with women's liberation at the time. But it helps to kind of set up for the future punk movement. And so kind of gender bending that we influenced people like David Bowie, amongst others. But it's really starting to be more visible with fashion. I can't talk about the 70s without talking about Halston, defining some of the iconic images of the leisure, kind of leisure jacket. But 70s was also when we realized that energy is not predictable, it's cheap energy. That we have to begin to think about what is actually sustainable in terms of how much energy we're using. So also in 1973, the beginning of the internet, DARPA, which is Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which is really a branch of the United States government, started the interneting project. And so this was starting to network computers. And so it was really what became the internet today. 1973, the first cell phone. Who knew? It's pretty amazing. I always thought it was the 1980s. But the mobility of the cell phone. 76, first Apple computer. Then 77, Apple II. Huge moments in getting computing to people, to the public. Interesting to put this into perspective where we were with architecture. And so here, the systems expressing themselves. So, the systems that we rely on for engineering, really becoming the architecture, the identity of the architecture itself. So late 70s, the punk movement is really starting to develop its own image through fashion. And so Vivienne Westwood, this kind of way of dressing, and which is kind of interesting because punk was supposed to be about rebellion, about not conforming, but yet it develops its own image through fashion. It's kind of the opposite of what you would think it would happen. But again, a very important kind of counterculture moment. Let's say kind of a punk architecture, Frank Gehry in his house in Santa Monica, using materials that you shouldn't use, right? Corrugated metal, chain link fence, exposed plywood, very rough and raw. And so challenging established notions of what architecture should be. First laptop computer. Osborne 1, 1980. So technology is getting smaller, it's becoming more portable. First 3D printer, 1983. Yeah. It became 3D Systems, the largest 3D printing company in the world now. They keep buying up all these smaller companies. But yeah, 1983, first 3D printer. It's been around for a long time. It's just now becoming accessible. So, you know, technology starts and it's very limited, but it grows. 1984, hugely important commercial. Amazing that a commercial could have this much impact. But, you know, have you guys seen this commercial? Oh, wow. You need to look up this commercial. So it's playing on George Orwell's 1984, the book, and the idea that you know, all these people they're all dressed in gray, they all have shaved heads, and so they're all kind of following the masses. And this woman kind of runs out from behind the screen, and this kind of idea of this authoritarian control of the government is kind of, you know, shouting at the people, and she comes in and just kind of throws this hammer and breaks the screen. And so it's this moment of Apple saying, we are our own culture, and really starting to define what this tech culture is about freedom. And so, you know, they saw very early on the vision that technology could have on liberating people, access to information. And so this commercial is incredibly important. It's still it's considered one of the best commercials ever. So take a look on YouTube. So 1980s, in Europe, very different situation than the United States. Europe, you've got high tech, is really more of the focus, high tech architecture. You know, Lloyd's of London, really, you know, still following up on Centre Pompidou, this idea of expressing the systems. So here, every system still being expressed in Lloyd's of London. Or, you know, Jean Nouvel, these really mechanical apertures for controlling the environment in terms of light. In the United States, we have yuppies. And so yuppies were, it stands for young urban professionals. You're young, upwardly mobile, meaning that you're making more money. And so it was about corporate power and about gaining money. It was about yourself and making as much money as you could. And so it was, you know, after the 60s, of, you know, love to everybody, the 1980s were about, I'm looking after me. And so, but that really had a lot to do with kind of promoting corporate power. And so the postmodernist architecture, similarly, using this idea of reference to classical architecture, was really about supporting corporate power. And it was really a kind of unfortunate time for American architecture. But then you have people like David Burns and Talking Heads, The Big Suit, kind of this critique on this conformity and the suit as a status symbol. And so it's very, you know, I'd say kind of subtle critique. Not everybody really understood it. But again, I think it's a really interesting moment. Also, David Byrne and his bandmates were all in architecture school before they created the Talking Heads. Enter deconstructivism, which is really just, it is postmodernism. It's just taking all the components of postmodernism and rearranging, pulling it apart, putting things back together to reveal new meaning. So Yohji Yamamoto, still an incredibly influential fashion designer now, starting to understand deconstructivism as a way to break the rules of fashion and literally kind of pulling things apart and revealing new conditions. Gautier, very similarly, starting to pull things apart and reconfigure. Issey Miyake, really ahead of his time here. It's hard to put him into a deconstructivist category because I think he was really kind of a precursor to kind of blob architecture in a way and understanding the surface. And I was actually, when I put this together, I was really surprised because I was familiar with this piece, and APOC means a piece of cloth. So it's always made out of kind of one piece of cloth. He just did a whole series of these. I was surprised to find out it was 1986. I thought it was the 1990s for sure. So I put that in there just as the kind of precursor to blob architecture. But going back to deconstructivism, Peter Eisenman with his House 10 series, Wexner Center, very much about understanding the system, here being influenced by Giuseppe Terrani, and this organizing system, pulling it apart, reconfiguring, putting things back together to try and alter the meaning. 1991, first web page, came out of CERN. And really this is the first time that the World Wide Web was made available to the public. And that's really what the World Wide Web is about, is no longer keeping it closed to academics. It was making it public. So 1991. And this is the beginning of the tech boom. And so AOL, Yahoo, Amazon, 1994, Hotmail, 1996. So really it's, 1991 was the first time you could get an email address. And so, I didn't get my first email until 1995, or I guess 96, because I got Hotmail when it first became available. But Google, 1998. It's something we think it's been around forever, but only 1998. First smartphone, 1992. But this idea of media starting to influence architecture. So Toyo Ito using projection, mixing media and architecture. So the moving image is starting to become the facade. Bernard Schumi with the video pavilion. Here the moving image is becoming so ubiquitous, it's really defining the architecture more than the glass. And so I'm showing it during the day, but it's really at night, and it's the reflections off of the glass. So the glass is there to provide reflections of the video, and so it's multiplying the moving image. And so it's this constantly moving image that is defining the surface of architecture in the glass pavilion. Deconstructivism in terms of really kind of pulling things apart, the shards and the looseness of architecture. At this point, Pimmelblau probably being some of the most shard-like, but then Yamamoto, similarly through fashion, finding very similar language of kind of shards. Then the more sensuous, but still this idea of layers, multiple layers, revealing the layers behind. Again, very deconstructivist. And Watanabe, again, starting to pull things apart, reconfigure, very architectural, way of dealing with surfaces. Blob architecture, obviously a huge influence on how we're using technology. So this is really digital architecture. We weren't really able to control this level of precision prior to being able to model it and be able to output it through the CNC mill. And so you can see the size that they're able to start creating. But going back to fashion, Rei Kawakoba, really starting to rethink how the body image, and so this idea of these kind of blobs being inserted into the dresses starts to adjust the way we're thinking about the body. Influence of animation. Greg Lynn being highly influenced by animation software. This idea of animation through Hussein Chalayan. Here, literally, the table is this kind of animation device. Table becomes a dress. The chairs become dresses, and then the structure of the chairs become the suitcase that you take your architecture with you, your interior environment with you. Fabric, kind of rethinking how we're thinking of skin. And so here, the Gina concept project for BMW, the fabric is now something, we're seeing that the skin is something malleable. It opens and closes. The headlights open and close. The skin is something that is adjustable. It's not just something that's fixed. And so this is really coming out of discussions. I'm trying to remember the chief designer at BMW, good friends with Greg Lynn. So they had a lot of discussions, so a lot of influence back and forth. But really rethinking, what is the skin of a car? How do we make it? And so this idea of new technology of fabrics, lighter weight, provide new opportunities for adjustability and movement within skin systems. So embedding interactive technologies. Here, Mijun Yoon, who's now the chair of the architecture department at MIT, made this dress that has a sensor, and so as you get closer, kind of keeps people away. And so it's defensible dress. But embedding interactive technology into fashion. Digital architecture, through the means of production, through CNC mills mostly, being able to translate the digital architecture from the screen into physical reality. Things like the pavilion, a very liquid architecture, but finally becoming achievable through automation. Hussein Chalayan in the kind of mechanical dress, bringing movement and this kind of idea of the panelization here, the custom panelization. Hussein Chalayan bringing some of that panelization in. It's interesting to note Hussein Chalayan, when I was at UCLA, he came and lectured as in the architecture school. And so again, friends with Greg Lynn and this kind of back and forth, developing this larger culture of design. Iris van Herpen, very interesting Dutch designer. She's probably closer to your age than my age. But she works with architects, which I think is really interesting, this partnership. And so here, 3D printing. She doesn't do the 3D modeling. She works with architects who do the 3D modeling and the 3D printing. But in 2010, making some of the first 3D printed garments for the body. And definitely check out her work. She does some really, really fabulous, really amazing work. Laser cutting, right? So different technologies, starting to influence how fashion can be made. Have to put in first iPhone, 2007. And so, the touchscreen device, as a way of interfacing with technology, radically changed. It moved away from buttons to the screen only. So simplification, minimalism as a design aesthetic as well. Materiality, changing, thermobimetals. Here, the metal opens and closes depending on heat. And so as the sun hits this installation, it warms up the metal, it opens, and as soon as the shadow hits it, it starts to close. And so no motors, no electricity, it's just the nature of the material itself. And so really starting to look at material behavior and having kind of its own life. Akim Menges also looking at material properties here, wood, how it reacts to the humidity of the air. And so the different levels of humidity, these apertures open and close. Have you guys seen this at Centre Pompidou? It's pretty amazing. 3D printed fashion, Francis Batoni here, just literally plastic, so not soft materials yet. Soft materials are soon to come. But really starting to look at the possibilities of 3D printed fashion. Jenny Wu, she's an architect, making her own custom jewelry line. And then this is a really, nervous systems is a very interesting architecture collaboration. I don't know if you can call them an architecture firm. But they do a lot of like Grasshopper and programming. And so they made this 3D printed dress. This is how it prints. Then you pull it out and it becomes the full dress. So they can make the entire dress in one bed. Pretty smart. So it's thinking about the joints and the movement of the joints. Do you know that Rem Koolhaas's son has a shoe company? So Rem D. Koolhaas, Rem Koolhaas's son. United Nude is his company. They do really interesting work. And so they actually recently, UN Studio, Zaha Hadid, and several other architects designed some shoes that are all 3D printed for United Nude. Again, Francis Batoni, he's a really interesting, I think he's a British, trained as an architect, doing fashion now through computation. And so here it's kind of a voxel way of working, programming, 3D printing these shoes. And so in many ways this was a setup for this class that I was teaching. I just want to run through a few projects that came out of the class. And so here we started the class by looking at precedents. And so we looked at fashion, architecture, film, technology. And so here looking at Iris van Herpen, they diagram it, break it down, understand what are the underlying rules for how it's made. Obviously very architectural fashion. Again, she's using plastic and non-typical fashion materials in a very architectural way. And so the students are starting to break this down and understand it. Friato, understanding the skin surface. And so this is the multi-hull. Very fascinating. Do you guys know how this was made? This is super cool. And so the actual pavilion, they made flat. They basically wove the wood, and they made a fabric out of the wood, and then they brought the edges in, and it popped up into place. And so it was this idea of tension. And so they were starting to look at how you can develop a fabric, and through tension, this all was about tension. So the tension of the fabric with the plastic, the tension to make these different geometries. So there were, so looking at the force for bending. And so Frei Otto's multi-hull was also about this tension that creates form. But also sails, the way that they make sails now for boats. Having these battens in it, and the way that the structure is woven into the fabric creates tension that creates the form. And so looking at these different precedents, then they developed a diagram, starting to develop in Grasshopper here, that started to combine these different ideas of tension and being able to kind of create the form out of the tension of a fabric. And so then they developed their own fabric. So this is kind of a custom-made fabric here out of plastic. And then, this was milled, the CNC mill. And so then, these are all the parts to make that fabric piece. And then they take their fabric and they design a garment for the body. So again, this is fashion students and architecture students working together. The architecture students doing all the programming, the Grasshopper work, and the fashion students contributing to the concept and idea, but also understanding how things kind of fit the body. The body is a very complex geometry. But I think if architects can do something for the body, you can model anything. And so here, this team was trying to develop a garment for a ballet dancer. And so it was really about putting tension to stay upright. And so it was putting forces on the body, so using the bending force of the material to actually kind of adjust the way you stand. And so they started to develop the Grasshopper script and kind of diagramming where the forces occur. Then this is the garment. So not a traditional garment at all, very architectural. The bolts as a way of connecting, but turned out to be a very elegant piece as well. This group was looking at obviously the influence of the spine, creating a new spinal system. They were looking at different precedents that were protecting the spine. Things like motorcycle protection, that if you're in an accident, that protects the spine. And so with this one, they created a series of 3D prints and wove this stretchable string through it to kind of hold it tight to the body. And so as the body moves, all these flex and the kind of exaggeration of these, you'll see it start to move, and so it has a very kind of spine-like quality to it, and it wraps around the front. This group was starting to look at different ways to project lines that would develop a twist in the series of strips. And so this is the kind of rendering that came of it from the Grasshopper script. And so it was these multiple layers. One strip would twist one way, the other strip would twist the other to kind of balance themselves out. So this is kind of the model of the different layers, the prototype that they've developed for that. This is one for a headpiece. And so looking at different iterations of density, the extent of the surface. I think maybe the iterations are more successful than the final prototype. And the last one I want to show, here they're starting to really look at the human body and starting to organize the geometry according to the body. Developing a system of these tubes, kind of front and side elevation, those tubes were all, or the garment was kind of broken into different panels, milled out on the CNC mill. And so there's a positive and a negative mold that work together. And then they actually cast fabric into the, so the fabric goes between these, and then they're putting silicone, injecting silicone into the molds. And so this is just one of the typical panels. And you can see there's a fabric that connects these different tubes. And so they were able to basically continue on to make the entire garment out of these series of strips of silicone. And that was kind of referencing back for you guys who were here on my Sunday lecture about the CBS tower by Eero Saarinen, which had those lines going down the facade where air and water was being channeled through, or the La Rinascente building in Rome that had the air channels kind of expressed on the outside. And so they were making this series of tubes where air could be kind of passed up and down the body to make this kind of personal environment. And this is the final garment out of the silicone. So it's really interesting because the silicone is soft. So it kind of feels like a new skin as well. So that was the class. Okay.